problem is people don't understand what diversification means. They think if they have 50 stocks in 10 sectors, semiconductors, consumer non-durables, or whatever, they're diversified. And what I say to them is, you may have 50 stocks, but that's one asset class. You're in stocks. And in stressful situations, they become highly correlated. So you're not getting the benefit of diversification. You think you are, but you're not. So what does a diversified portfolio look like? Well, I have a slice of stocks. I'm not anti-stock market, but you got to pick the sectors and the stocks that will perform well, even in the kind of conditions we're talking about. And I would go back to energy, natural resources, agriculture. So, a Marathon, ExxonMobil, Chevron, ADM, Cargill, mining companies, and not just gold, yeah, but I recently invested in a lithium mine. I think the climate alarmists, I think the Green New Deal, I call it the Green New Scam. It's a scam, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have legs, whether you like it or not. The fact is, it's going to go on. So the lithium's in short supply, graphite, et cetera. So there is a portfolio you can have, which is natural resource oriented, that will do well, even in the kind of tough environment we're talking about. Slug of cash, absolutely, maybe as much as 30%. I like treasury notes, 10-year treasury notes, but seasoned to taste. If they're a little too volatile, look at 5-year notes, 2-year notes. They're going to come down a lot, not right away, not tomorrow morning, but sooner than later, because of everything we discussed, which is a recession, and interest rates will follow. They're a lagging indicator, but that'll happen. Gold, I always recommend 10% slice. Absolutely. There's hate to get too deep in the weeds in terms of bond math, but there's something called a DV01. DV01 is the dollar value of 1 basis point. What that means is, obviously, basic bond math, interest rates come down, the price of the bond goes up. They're just inverted. It's a little counterintuitive, but rates come down, the bond goes up. The question is how much? And the lower the interest rate, the more the price of the bond goes up for every basis point drop in rates. So in other words, if you go from 9% to 8%, you'll have a nice capital gain on your bond. But if you go from 3% to 2%, it's still a 1% drop, but you're going to have a much bigger capital gain. In each instance, it's a 1% drop in rates, but the amount of capital gain on the bond is much higher. As the DV01 is higher when the rates are lower. Again, it's all counterintuitive. Right. But the lower the rate, the greater the capital gain on each basis point drop. That's the basically. So yeah, when you go from 3% to 2%, that's a home run in terms of capital gains. So you get the yield, you get the safety, you get the liquidity, and if you feel like selling it, you got a nice fat capital gain. Yeah, but based on what we were talking about, I would get silver dollars, American Silver Eagles. Yeah, a monster box. That's bit of jargon. Monster box comes from the U.S. Mint. It's Treasury green, nice shade of green. It comes with a compression strap. I recommend don't open it, unless do not break except in case of fire. But inside are 500 1-ounce American Silver Eagles. That's a lot. They'll feed your family for probably a year, and they run, it's a market price, but be around $10,000-$12,000 for a monster box. But to me, it's like battery and flashlights. Just have one, stick it in a safe place. Yeah, I like them both, and I talk about gold a lot because it's a form of money, and I do the monetary analysis. I do invest in gold mines, but I don't hold myself out as a geologist. But I do think about it from a monetary perspective. And then people always say, "Jim, what about silver? What about silver?" I'm like, look, if gold soars the way I expect, silver's along for the ride. There's not going to be a world of $3,000 gold and $20 silver. That world doesn't exist. If gold's at 3,000, silver's going to be pushing 100. So without giving an exact forecast, silver will be along for the ride. Silver is a little more difficult to analyze because it has industrial applications. Gold really doesn't. Gold's not good for anything except money, but it's the best form of money. Silver is used in a lot of applications. So if you have a recession, it's perhaps the case that the monetary value is going up, but the industrial input value is going down. So it's a little bit more of a mixed bag, but silver is going to do fine. And I do think it's extremely practical because in a world of CBDCs, silver will be a form of spending money. Gold, even the 8-gram coin I mentioned, the quarter ounce American Gold Eagle, still $500. It's like pulling a $500 bill out of your wallet. You know, it's a lot for groceries. Yeah, income producing real estate. I wouldn't get into commercial real estate, residential. Yeah, the prices are, you know, home prices are coming down a little more in some markets than others. But if it's income producing and it's solid and it's in a place like, you know, someplace people want to be, like Austin or Phoenix or whatever. I mean, I know there's markets down a little bit right now, but you know, it's like buying a 10-year bond. You know, it's got steady monthly income and or certainly farmland, but income producing real estate, not commercial office buildings, should be a part of a diversified portfolio. Yes. I like private equity, and it's, you know, you got accredited investor issues and finding good deals and good promoters and good management. But you know, there's some you know, some good deals in the mining sector. I like seriously, everything we talked about is sort of pales in comparison to what's going on in Ukraine. We're kind of on the march toward nuclear war. If you talk about what they call legacy media, mainstream media, so Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, NBC, ABC, CBS, MSNBC, right, CNN, that run of characters, the first thing you discover is, I know a lot of these people. I've been on all these programs. I know this for a long time. I spent a lot of time in Washington, had dinner with most of the, or lunch or whatever, dinner actually more often with most of the names you've heard about. Some of them are fine, some of them nice. A lot of them are either not that bright, or, I mean, they're good on camera, or whatever. They got a desk at the Washington Post. They're not that bright. Or if they've got some degrees, they've been kind of indoctrinated. We're at the point now. I mean, a lot of these people are 28, 33, 34 years old. There's nothing wrong with that. That's, you know, good. You're in the heart of your career. But that means they graduated from school in, you know, 2016, 2017, or whatever. And they're thoroughly indoctrinated. I mean, I went to school when we learned it was pretty rigorous. I mean, I had one program where they graded, you needed a C+ average to graduate, but they graded on a C- curve. So you're like, how do you get it? How do you even get a C+ if they're grading on a C- curve? The answer is people quit. And in other words, you were trying to struggle to be. I did get an A in partnership taxation. I'm proud of that. But the standards are down. The mission standards are down. Affirmative action takes over. When you get into the classroom, I don't care where you're at, you know, Ivy League, whatever, it's just indoctrination. The market has a way of sorting it out. I mean, if revenues are down, advertising's down, viewers are down, subscriptions are down, eventually, as you said, they will go out of business, not overnight. And then new media channels will arise. And, you know, there's a lot of garbage on the internet, but there's a lot of good stuff. And, you know, if you want to keep tabs on the war in Ukraine, you have to know where to look. It's not easy, but there are a number of channels with, and I'm talking about, you know, military officers, you know, colonels, you know, brigadier generals, people on the ground in Ukraine, not, you know, some studio in New York. You can find out what's going on, but I think my intelligence training is helpful because you have to be very persistent and know how to dig. We may have a very bad recession, possibly worse than 2008. So tell me why it's a buy signal for stocks if the Fed is throwing the economy into such a bad recession that unemployment is going to go up significantly and growth is going to come down, inflation is going to come down. Why is that a buy signal for stocks? Maybe at the bottom, you know, and the bottom might not be till late 2023. Okay, yeah, there are opportunities to buy the bottom, but we'll be nowhere near the bottom. Bear market rallies are really interesting. Some of the biggest rallies in history have been in the middle of bear markets where you ended up losing everything, but for a couple of days or weeks even, it's, hey, the bottom's in, and you buy stocks, etc. So you have to watch out for that. So we're flying into a really bad recession. The stock market's starting to get the message, but you know, you've got this pivot narrative. You can't quite get rid of that. Some of the buy the dips people are still around, so count on them to, you know, buy into what could be a horrendous bear market. You got your buy and hold crowd. You know, remember in 2000, 2001, the NASDAQ dropped 80%. And a lot of people got out, but they said, well, just hold on to it. Well, it did come back, but it took until 2015. I mean, that's a long time. A lot of people died in the meantime. You know, you're waiting 14 years to get back to where you were. So those people are still around, but there is what I call the pivot crowd. So the Fed pivot is a narrative, and it kind of goes like this. Yeah, the Fed's tightening. We see that. Inflation is going to come down really fast. The economy is going to slow down really fast. Both of those things are happening. Inflation little less so, but the economic slowdown is there. And the Fed's going to get the wake-up call and have to cut rates. And cutting rates, that's the pivot. They're going to pivot from rate hikes to rate cuts. And that's good for tech stocks, so buy stocks. Now, that's the narrative. It prevailed in late July and most of August. The stock market did go up. There was a decent rally in the middle of what's become a bear market based on this Fed narrative that they were going to have to cut rates. There are two huge fallacies in that narrative. The first one is who says the Fed's going to get the message? And if you look at what Jay Powell said and what he repeated, we're going to raise rates. We're going to crush inflation. I've been following this for 50 years. I've never seen a Fed chairman use the word pain 3 times in one paragraph, but he did, and he meant it. He knows there's going to be a recession. They're causing it in part. Unemployment's going to go up. He said that. He tied unemployment to killing, basically demand destruction and getting inflation under control. He said, that's how we're going to do it. And you're already starting to see some early signs of that. So with that as their focus, who says the Fed's going to, get a wake-up call? Almost certainly not. I mean, they told us what they're going to do. They're going to raise rates. And then he said, if we see progress on inflation, we'll pause. But pause doesn't mean cut. It means just wait a long time, because at that point, core PCE, that's personal consumption expenditure, core, which excludes oil and food, and that's just how they do it. That's their favorite metric. You can debate whether it's the best one, but the debate doesn't matter because that is the one they use. Let's say that comes down to around 3.5. Okay, it's still not 2. Now, what Powell, which is their target, so what Powell said is, we don't have to keep raising rates to force it to 2. We just have to raise them enough that it'll get to 2 on its own. That's what they call restrictive policy. So, but that's not a rate cut. He said that might last for a year, all the way into 2024. That's when he was talking about rate cuts. Now, again, this can change, but they've told us what they're going to do. I always say, forecasting the Fed's the easiest thing I do, because they actually tell you what you're going to do, what they're going to do. You just have to listen and believe them. Now, the hard part is understanding how badly they're going to destroy the economy and when they're going to get the wake-up call. That's the hard part of the analysis. But telling you what they're going to do is the easy part, because they kind of tell you. So the stock market notion that somehow they'll be cutting rates is just false. I was around for the 2008 financial crisis. I was around for 1998 financial crisis. I negotiated that bailout for LTCM. 98 was interesting because it was an acute financial crisis that came very close, within hours, actually. And I was in the room with the Treasury and Italian finance ministry and 19 banks and a thundering herd of lawyers trying to save the world. But we came within hours of shutting every market in the world. There was a $4 billion all cash. You couldn't use the word due diligence because there wasn't time. It was just, hey, the Fed wants us to do this, so let's just do it. So that worked, but it was a very close call. They would have shut down Tokyo and then around the world, London and finally New York. And they would have opened days later, but that's how, with trillions of dollars of losses, it would have been worse than what actually happened in 2008. It didn't happen, but there was no economic recession at the time. That confuses a lot of people, because, and particularly if you're using 2008 as a frame of reference, there are financial panics and financial crises and liquidity crises, and there are recessions, some of which are severe. But they're two different things. 98 was an acute financial crisis with no recession. 2000 was a mild recession, but there was no severe financial crisis. Now, NASDAQ collapsed, but there wasn't a lot of leverage in NASDAQ. There was no contagion there, but it didn't spread because no banks failed, no major brokerages failed, et cetera. So in 1990, a mild recession, but no financial panic. October 1987, interesting, stock market fell 22% in one day. Not a week or a month, but one day, down 22%. And that was a financial crisis, but there was no recession. So they're separate things. However, they can happen together. And 2008 was an example. There we had both. But I would encourage analysts to separate those two things. Again, they came together. It was horrific, but but they can happen separately. My point is, what's coming is a very severe recession. The monetary tightening on top of a world where growth is deaccelerating, inventories are sky high. The funny thing about the supply chain, we all remember headline, supply chain's broken down, the shelves are bare. So all true. That was happening at the time, and that's when I started working on the book. But what a lot of purchasing managers did, and inventory managers, they doubled their orders. They said, well, or tripled the orders. They said, well, if the supply chain's breaking down and I want just a normal amount, I better order 3 times as much or twice as much just to get what I want. And they did. Well, what happened was by the summer, some of that pressure had been alleviated, and here come the shipments into the warehouses that are twice as much or 3 times as much as what you needed at the exact same time that the Fed was destroying demand. And so demand drops off a cliff, retail sales drop off a cliff, the warehouses go from being empty to being full to the rafters, and now all that merchandise is sitting there. So, Nike, just many examples. So what do you do when you're in charge of inventory? You cut prices. You don't want that inventory. It costs a lot of money to keep it in the warehouses, number one. Number two, a lot of it's seasonal. It's like, who wants to buy, summer dress in December? Not too many people. So they just slash prices, and that reduces margins and reduces profits. So we're just kind of flying into the face of all that. With the Fed tightening rates into weakness. The Fed will be the last to know because they're very model driven and the models are badly flawed, mostly with the Phillips curve and their focus on the unemployment rate, which is not a good measure of what's going on in the labor force. So my expectation is the recession's coming. It's going to be really bad. Inflation is going to come down fast, but not quite fast enough for the Fed. They're going to keep raising rates, destroying demand, raising unemployment. And we're going to wake up with a severe recession, high unemployment, and a much lower stock market. I was having dinner with a friend not long ago in New York City. We met at a place called Oriole, which is in Midtown. My dinner companion that night was a senior advisor to BlackRock. As you may know, BlackRock is now the largest asset manager on the planet. It directly manages $5 trillion in assets, and it oversees another $11 trillion through its Aladdin platform. That means one firm controls more money than the GDPs of China, Russia, and Japan combined. Anyway, my dinner companion happens to work directly for BlackRock's CEO. As we nursed our white wine and the evening wore on, she let something slip. If I remember her words, she said something like, "They want to tell us we can't sell." What was she talking about? Who was she talking about? I placed a few calls, first to my contacts in Washington, then to a few people on Wall Street. Soon I was on a plane for a series of meetings to London, to Geneva, back to New York, then down to South America. As I began connecting the dots, a pattern emerged. It revealed a network of more than 189 individuals positioned inside the world's major financial institutions. Some of them hold senior positions inside the IMF, World Bank, and every central bank in the G20, including our own Federal Reserve. These elites share one vision, and they're about to make it a reality. That vision is one world order, one world taxation, and one world money. They've worked for years behind the scenes preparing to realize that vision. They've literally rigged the laws of international finance. Everything is basically in place right now, and there's essentially no way to stop this from happening. When the crisis hits, they'll flip the switch, freezing the global financial system. That will give them time to reset the world economy according to their vision. As the coming crisis unfolds, President Trump will be powerless to stop it. In fact, trying to stop them would probably weaken the president's power altogether.
That is amazing. Jim, really? So what do these elites want from your contact at BlackRock?
Basically, they want to classify BlackRock as too big to fail. The technical term is Systemically Important Financial Institution, or SIFI. That designation normally applies to banks, such as Bank of America. If your bank gets the SIFI label, it means the government will bail you out first in a crisis. But it also means you must turn over control of your bank until the crisis subsides. In this case, they're trying to reclassify BlackRock, an asset manager, as too big to fail. If they succeed, they'll be able to freeze BlackRock when the crisis hits. BlackRock clients won't be able to sell. They won't be able to buy either. Their accounts will go dark indefinitely. And the elite operatives will take control of BlackRock's assets remotely via the internet. But our research shows that their ICE 9 plan goes much, much deeper than that.
You refer to their plan as ICE 9. You just said that. What does that mean?
It's a reference to the Kurt Vonnegut novel, Cat's Cradle. In the book, a mad scientist creates a new form of water molecule called ICE 9. When it comes in contact with other water molecules, it freezes them at room temperature. One drop of ice-9 can freeze the whole ocean. And that's what these elite operatives are about to do to the world economy.
Now, can you share with our viewers exactly who these operatives are and what their ultimate goal might be?
Like I said, John, more than 189 elite agents have slowly wormed their way into leadership positions across the board. They now sit at or near the head of the IMF, the World Bank, and even our own Federal Reserve. They also control much of what happens at the central banks of China, Russia, India, Brazil, Canada, and Europe. As you know, these institutions form a kind of global superstructure. It forms a kind of snare net encircling all nations. Their leaders aren't democratically elected. They're not accountable to you and me. They're beyond the reach of government and citizens, and yet they hold the fate of the global financial system in their hands. To get a sense of how they operate, imagine an array of floating spheres. One sphere is labeled IMF. One is labeled Fed. One is labeled Bilderberg. One is labeled Wall Street. One is labeled central banks. One is labeled intelligence agencies. One is labeled media, and so on. The elites inhabit all of these spheres, and together the network forms a kind of 3D Venn diagram. As I see it, regardless of what sphere they inhabit, the elites all share the same vision: one world order, one world taxation, and one world money. All of their actions are geared toward moving that agenda forward.
Are you able to share the identities of these elites with our viewers?
We've identified more than 189 individuals who are in many cases hiding in plain sight. Regardless, they all share the same vision: one world order, one world taxation, and one world money. A short list would include Christine Lagarde, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, IMF; Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England; Raghuram G. Rajan, Vice Chairman of the Bank for International Settlements; Haruhiko Kuroda, Governor of the Bank of Japan; William C. Dudley, President of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York; Agustin Carstens, Governor of the Bank of Mexico; Janet Yellen, Chairman of the Board of the Federal Reserve System; Mario Draghi, President of the European Central Bank; Zhu Min, former Deputy Managing Director of the IMF; Zhou Zhiuquan, Governor of the People's Bank of China; Robert E. Rubin, Chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. This A-list of central bankers and other elites is just the tip of the iceberg. Of course, not one of these elites will tell you outright what's going on, but I've seen and heard enough to connect the dots for myself. Not long ago, for example, I met with one of their senior operatives. He's a leading economist who served as the chairman of the Federal Reserve during the last crisis. He's considered one of the most influential minds in banking today. We met privately during a conclave in Seoul, South Korea. I came away from my meeting with him stunned and convinced that ICE-9 was real. Not long before that, I set up a one-on-one meeting with another member of the network. His name is Zhu Min, the former deputy governor of China's central bank. Until recently, he served as deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund. Zhu is a brilliant guy, like Bernanke, and he's pleasant and well-meaning. There's no doubt in my mind that he's also a member of the elite network preparing to impose ICE-9 on millions of Americans. But I wasn't done with my research. I have since met with dozens of senior officials, intelligence analysts, and former Wall Street colleagues. My quest led to a final meeting, a face-to-face summit with the head of Bilderberg. We met at Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, and he was very eager to get my take on the euro as a currency. I was happy to provide it, of course, in exchange for some valuable intelligence. As I say in my new book, he did not have horns. In fact, he gave me a nice gift when we parted ways, a blue Swedish vase. I keep it in my writing studio at my home in Connecticut. But my point is, I came away from all three meetings convinced of one thing. When the next crisis hits, the elites are planning to freeze the financial system, and they'll replace it with a new system, one not based on the U.S. dollar. When that happens, we'll wake up to a very strange and disturbing new reality.
And for our viewers that are watching today, what might their reality look like that morning? How does this manifest?
First, they'll have gone to bed knowing that a massive financial crisis was underway. But when they wake up, they'll find it has worsened and the contagion has spread worldwide. When they go to withdraw money, their ATM will say, closed temporarily. When they go to sell stocks, their account will say, transaction not available. When they go to their local business, that business will only accept cash if it's open. As citizens realize they're being barred from their money, riots will erupt. It's going to get really bad really quickly.
How would such a freeze actually work? And wouldn't that be highly illegal?
Well, it wouldn't be illegal technically because they've been quietly laying the groundwork for years. They've rigged the financial laws, changed the rules of the game to allow this to happen. The stage is set. They have the levers in place. The lights are positioned. Now someone just needs to flick a switch and they'll impose ICE-9 rapidly. And again, all of this will be legal because they've rigged the system in their favor. Here in the US, for example, Congress pushed through something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. This allows the government to freeze accounts, assets, even whole institutions at will. The only condition is that there's some threat to national security with a foreign connection. Of course, with a global market, every financial crisis has a foreign connection. Any systemic crisis fits the bill. And the thing is, when the next crisis hits, it's going to be so bad, President Trump won't have any choice but to go along with the elite's plan.
You have to admit, that sounds somewhat hard to believe. Now, how could these operatives actually freeze the whole country's financial system?
Well, fortunately, we have some recent real-life examples to study. The elites have been conducting a series of dry runs for years, leading up to ICE 9. Look at Cyprus, for example. A few years ago, the Cypriot economy was in trouble, especially the banks. The IMF stepped in and loaned Cyprus $10 billion, but the loan came with strings. Now pay attention, because this is precisely what they're going to do. But imagine it on a global scale. So in exchange for the capital injection, the IMF demanded control over the Cypriot banking system. More specifically, the IMF froze the entire system, literally every bank in the country. And they did that to ensure the IMF's demands were met, including strict capital controls.
Jim, these insights resonate strongly. Our audience surprises me with their understanding of complex topics when we discuss them. Many are well-versed in these matters, easily grasping the crucial elements available to those who know where to look. We've recently recorded an exclusive video discussing an upcoming geopolitical shockwave, a major development in global finance since 1971. We'll also offer strategies for individuals to benefit from this crisis. Regarding the economic situation, you've pointed to the Biden administration for depleting our oil reserves significantly, surpassing all previous presidents. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine adds to these challenges. How much blame rests with the president versus supply chain issues? And as we're about 17 months away from an election, where do we currently stand?
It's a great list, Brian, because you can say, well, we could talk about the war in Ukraine. Yeah, we could talk about monetary policy. We just kind of did go through some of the recession indicators. We can talk about the election. But they're all connected. I mean, that's really where the complexity theory and the density of the network comes in, because these things are all connected. So just to spend a minute on Ukraine. By the way, I just last week I do this annually, so it's been 8 years in a row. Conducted a seminar on financial warfare at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And it is at the Army War College, but there are people there from all branches. It's a very elite group, handpicked about 12 students, mid-career officers. So they're kind of late 30s, early 40s, lieutenant colonels, and from all branches like at Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and a few civilians, State Department and CIA, NSA, intelligence community. But it's a fun group, 1,213. I look at the resume, it's amazingly accomplished. They all have multiple master's degrees, the occasional PhD, speak 4 languages, been deployed from Iraq to Colombia or wherever, but they've been handpicked as the future big brains. These are people. 5 years from now, there'll be 3-star generals on the National Security Council, etc. It's a fun class, and my topic is financial warfare, which is kind of like finance and warfare, which is what we're mashing up right now. And I spent a lot of time talking about this whole BRICS thing, and we can talk about that if you like. But I tell interviews like this, Brian, I always explain. I said I didn't say anything in the U.S. Army war colors that I'm not saying in this interview. It's not like I have a secret package for them and we do something else. I just say the same thing. You can take it or leave it. You can agree or disagree, but it's a great group, very interactive. But I was talking about the Ukraine war, and I said one of the most difficult things about this is getting reliable information in a war. Everybody lies, so the US lies. If you ask me what has surprised me about the war, the conduct of the war, the development, hasn't really been a surprise. Russia was always going to win. Just question how long. It's tragic. But I'm surprised at how many warmongers there are in the know. They're mushy. Germany's between a rock and hard place. Hungary is actually against the no. Again, a little. Sorry. The US has the warmongers, I know that. But starting with Boris Johnson and going to Rishi Sunak, I mean, they're more bloodthirsty than the Americans, and they're the ones providing the Challenger tanks, etc. I don't quite get it. I think all these Chamberlain, Churchill, Hitler metaphors fall down. I mean, I know history. I know what Chamberlain did. And I know Winston Churchill was one of the great heroes of the 20th century. But I don't see that parallel. Are they doing it to try to get a better trade deal with the US? Is it that simple or no? Well, it disappoints me to see the UK act as kind of lackeys of the... It's sad to know it's not the heyday of the British Empire, but it's one of the largest economies in the world. Major financial center, nuclear power. I mean, it's not like it's a tertiary power, but I see what's going on. But I have to say I don't understand it. I don't see why the UK can't go their own way a little bit. But they are, so they're not. But not to get too immersed in the positive. You can pretty much lay the entire Ukrainian tragedy at Biden's feet because Ukraine would not. Russia would not have invaded Ukraine in February of 2022 if they hadn't been provoked for 14 years. I mean, going back to 2008. So what happened in 2008? George W. Bush stands up at a NATO summit and says Georgia and Ukraine should join NATO. He just said that. 3 months later, Putin invades Georgia. That's right. 2008 Olympics. So Bush says Georgia and Ukraine should join NATO. Putin almost immediately invades Georgia and takes the place over. It's like, were you not paying attention? Did you not get the message? And we had the global financial crisis and a lot else. So fast forward to 2014. What happens? They have an election in Ukraine. A pro-Russia, pro-Putin president wins. You can debate election. How high quality was the election? You can say, I don't like the guy, but he won. There actually was an election. And within months, the MI6 and CIA working with neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine. And they've been there since the Second World War. Overthrow the guy. They basically had the Maiden Square Color Revolution, so-called, which is all orchestrated by the intelligence agencies. They got snipers. They're killing people. The anti-Russian Ukrainians were doing the killing. And then the guy flees for his life, goes to Russia, and the US installs a puppet. Wasn't Soros funding Vice to go there and cover it in the central square? Correct. Yeah. And Victoria Dolan's behind the whole thing. She's got blood coming out of her mouth. I don't. So Putin's like, wait a second. We had an election. The pro-Russian guy wins. And you stage a coup, de facto coup, and kick him out and put in a puppet. So what does Putin do next? He invades Crimea or Nexus. Crimea takes it over. So it's like, okay, Georgia should join NATO. He invades Georgia. Ukraine should join NATO. We just had a coup. He takes over Ukraine. Are you not paying attention? You meaning the West, us, UK. Are you not paying attention to what's going on here? And then they sponsored anyway, without getting. They sponsored attacks on the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, etc. So by Putin's at the end of his rope now, yes, he did invade.
At a very high level, I would say there are numerous challenges and obstacles. We'll discuss all of them in detail. People attribute words to you and sometimes give you the reputation of being a pessimist. Jim Rickards is always discussing the apocalypse, which I do not. I never use that term, but I emphasize that despite the hardships, we don't have to be victims. We are not powerless. We don't need to withdraw from challenges. The crucial thing is to anticipate them. If you can foresee upcoming events, you can address them appropriately. You can navigate through them, not only preserving your wealth, but also potentially profiting. I frequently cite the case of Augustinus, and people might ask, who is he? He was an industrialist in Weimar, Germany, in the early 1920s, and he could foresee hyperinflation long before the middle class or anyone else. He borrowed a substantial amount of Reichsmarks, which was the currency at the time, and invested in industrial assets such as coal mines, vessels, and natural resources. When hyperinflation arrived, he allowed some time to pass, then repaid his debts. I would say he paid back a negligible fraction of the original debt, almost insignificant, but he repaid it while the currency was essentially worthless. He retained all the assets and eventually became the wealthiest individual in Germany. My German skills aren't excellent, but his nickname was the Inflation, signifying the Inflation King. There are other similar stories as well, like Joseph Kennedy during the 1929 crash. So, once again, we are not powerless. We can take action, but the key to empowerment, as I often stress, is anticipation. This is where thorough analysis plays a crucial role. You might wonder, am I more intelligent than others? Of course not. Many brilliant minds exist, but people often rely on flawed models. There's a lot of behavioral psychology behind it, such as confirmation bias and the belief that the future will resemble the past, which is often not the case. So, if you adhere to those models, you'll likely achieve poor results. It's difficult to think of an institution with a worse track record in forecasting than the Federal Reserve. The U.S. Federal Reserve, and perhaps the IMF is an exception, both have notably poor records. You could almost take the Fed's forecasts, do the opposite, and do just fine. There's more to it, but they tend to adhere to these flawed models. However, if you comprehend how the economy genuinely functions, understanding that it's a complex dynamic system, my approach is to apply complexity theory. Complexity theory has been around for quite some time, dating back to the Big Bang, the ultimate complex dynamic paradigm shift or phase transition that occurred around 13 billion years ago. However, the mathematical understanding of complexity theory emerged in the early 1960s. It has found successful applications in physics and other fields. I simply transferred it to capital markets, recognizing that capital markets are among the most complex dynamic systems, and adding human behavior to the mix further increases the complexity. These models work brilliantly when you have the right ones, but convincing others to understand and employ them can be challenging. Once again, the point is that with the right models, which should include behavioral psychology, a significant dose of history, complexity theory, and other branches of applied mathematics, you can achieve exceptional results. On the other hand, sticking with models like the Phillips curve and the non-accelerating inflation unemployment rate, as the Fed does, is likely to lead to errors. Does the future have some degree of resemblance to the past? Not always. In fact, it may occur less frequently now than ever before. Additionally, these models assume that prices change continuously. Prices fluctuate, of course, but markets don't always move smoothly. When they do, it often happens when you're not paying attention. When you are, they experience sudden gaps, either up or down. You might blink, and the market is at an entirely different level, having been revalued. Even though you can still enter or exit, you may have gained or lost a substantial amount of money in the blink of an eye. Considering these characteristics, and this is how I began to deconstruct the conventional wisdom, I realized that markets are not efficient, which is a flawed notion. They don't move continuously and gradually. They gap. If you're unprepared for this, you'll miss opportunities. Nothing in this context is entirely risk-free, so I started there. I began identifying the factors that, in my view, were inaccurately applied. You might ask, what resembles these characteristics? The answer is a complex dynamic system, the kind that generates hurricanes, tornadoes, lightning strikes, power outages, earthquakes, and tsunamis. All these phenomena result from complex dynamic systems. An earthquake doesn't sneak up on you. The ground suddenly shifts beneath you. Similarly, in financial markets, sudden and significant shifts occur. Therefore, I started to consider this as a more accurate model. Of course it is. Everything continually evolves. Another intellectual tool I use, which involves applied mathematics, is Bayes' theorem. Without delving into excessive detail, I learned about Bayes' theorem during my time at the CIA. I always say that if you have all the facts, a smart high school student can solve the problem. However, intelligence agencies and individuals in capital markets must solve problems when they don't possess all the facts. They have no choice. It's a matter of national security and defense or preserving one's financial well-being on Wall Street. You can't simply throw your hands up and say, "I'll wait for more facts to emerge." That approach doesn't work in the real world. Janet Yellen seems a bit detached from this reality. So, how do you solve problems when you lack complete information but still need to address the issue because it's approaching you? Bayes' theorem suggests assigning an initial probability and a priori assumption. You don't invent it, but you do your best, recognizing that you're working with incomplete information. If you have no facts at all and it's a binary outcome, assign a 50-50 probability. It's not precisely 50-50, but for a binary decision like red or black on a roulette table, it's slightly less than 50-50, but close enough. You say, it's either going to be red or black. I don't know which, so I'll assign a 50-50 probability. Subsequently, as new facts emerge, you update your model. Your probability either increases or decreases. If it decreases by a substantial amount, you discard that assumption, recognizing it was incorrect. You start over. However, if it increases, you're making it more likely that your initial assumption was correct. Over time, you can raise that probability to 80% or 90%, which isn't 100%, but it's quite robust. There's a crucial aspect to consider while updating, which was explained to me by Henry Kissinger. Imagine a simple graph where the vertical axis represents the probability of a specific outcome and the horizontal axis represents time or the amount of information you possess. Initially, at the start, you have little to no information, but you have ample time and flexibility. However, as you progress along the timeline, your information increases, which is a positive development, but you have less time and flexibility. Your probability curve rises while your time curve descends. When you reach the opposite end, you have perfect information, but it's too late to to act. The opportunity has passed, or the crisis has unfolded. So, the goal is to find the sweet spot in the middle, which I refer to as the Kissinger cross. In this zone, you have sufficient information to make informed decisions and enough time to act deliberately. You seek this sweet spot, and with a touch of humility, it becomes a powerful tool. In the CIA, you never have enough information. You're always striving to gather more, yet you must make assumptions and forecasts because you can't afford to wait for 10 9/11 events to have a substantial statistical basis. You're dealing with the one event you have, and your aim is to prevent the next one.
Jim Rickards discusses the power of narratives in shaping economic behavior. He references Robert Shiller's book on narrative economics, highlighting how narratives, whether true or false, can influence economic decisions. Rickards refers to the Great Depression, noting how the narrative of frugality prolonged economic distress until a shift in mindset towards spending led to recovery. He emphasizes the White House's failed attempt to push a positive economic narrative, despite contrasting harsh realities, pointing out inflation issues predating the war in Ukraine, and attributing energy price hikes more to domestic policy decisions than geopolitical conflicts.
People hear the government say the economy is fine or unemployment is near an all-time low, which is actually, statistically, is true. They kind of nod and go, yeah, it's all good. And then reality is the stuff that hits you in the head, like a 2x4. You know, the propaganda is positive. We could talk about that a little more detail. The reality is harsh, and reality wins. And there's a very good book on this by Robert Shiller, Nobel Prize-winning economist at Yale University. Not a huge fan of your garden variety PhD economists, but there are some good ones out there, and he's one of them. He wrote a book about, 2 years ago, maybe a little bit less, called Narrative Economics. He said, yeah, we got all the models in Phillips curve and wealth effect and various quantity theory of money, and some have a place. Some are more valuable than others. But don't underestimate the power of a narrative. A narrative is a story. It's a fancy name for a story, but a story that persists, that grows. And interestingly, in epidemiology, of course, we've just come through a pandemic. There's a model called the SIRE model that stands for susceptible. Are you susceptible to a virus? E for exposed. Are you exposed to it? I, are you infected? Did you get it? And R, did you recover? The difference between I and R are people who died. But it's a model when it's mathematically based and it's empirically validated of how viruses spread exponentially. And you can also use it to forecast how a virus is going to go. Well, what Shiller did, he took that model, moved it over to economics, and took a narrative kind of like a virus, not in a negative sense, just something that spreads. And it can be very powerful. And then eventually it may die out or reverse, but it can be powerful in the meantime. That much I knew. But what I learned from the book that I hadn't really thought about is that narratives don't have to be true. They can be true, and they can be very powerful. But a narrative can be false and still be powerful. If it's the self-fulfilling prophecy, if enough people believe it, it sort of becomes the reality to some extent, even if it's based on false premises. He gives an example during the Great Depression. The Great Depression really was 2 technical recessions. But there was a period from 1929 to 1933, election of Franklin Don and the Roosevelt. And then there was another period from 1933 to 1937. The 37 and 1940 part we leave aside for this purpose. But during the first part of the Great Depression, unemployment was high, output was dropping, trade was dropping. It was a very, very bad time, no doubt about it. But not everybody was out of work. Not everybody was poor. There were a lot of people with a lot of money at the time, but it was felt that being ostentatious was poor form. It's like, okay, I'm lucky I have a job, I've got some money, but I'm not going to buy a new car, buy a big house, or flash it around or whatever, because it's really not considered of all the people who actually have fallen on hard times. Well, that was the narrative. But it's the worst possible economic advice because it's precisely the fact that people with the money should keep spending. That kind of can boost the economy out of a depression. So by people saying, well, even though I have the money, I'm not going to spend it because it's poor form, we're actually prolonging the Great Depression. Now, when FDR came along, was elected in 1933, became president, 34, the psychology turned 180 degrees, and all of a sudden, the Democratic campaign song was Happy Days Are Here Again, and FDR seemed to solve the banking crisis and so forth. And all of a sudden, it became okay to spend money. Well, in the middle of the Great Depression, 1934 to 1936. Those were some of the strongest years ever for the stock market. And unemployment did come down a lot. Now, the problem is it came down from like 25% to 15%, while 15% is still painfully high. But it was a big move in the right direction. So he describes how the narrative flipped from don't spend money, it's poor form, to, yeah, go spend money and help the economy. None of that is taught in business school. It's not taught in economics. It can be modeled using this epidemiology model, but it doesn't fit into any of the standard macroeconomic models. But it's powerful stuff. And so today what's going on is that the White House is trying to push a narrative, and they're failing badly. But they'll say, if you listen to deliberations among White House officials, some of the stuff leaks to the press. And I know some of these people. It's like the economy is great. Unemployment is really low. We've created all these jobs since the pandemic. But we're doing a really bad job of messaging. The point is, they're inside the White House. They're frustrated that the positive economic story is not getting out the correct analysis, is that there is no positive economic story. The economy is in terrible shape. The problem is not the messaging, it's the message. And this is why I say the propaganda from the White House, if things are great, is at ODs with the reality, which is things are not great. Let me give you some specific data points, because, as I say, I don't like to make statements like this without backing it up. Number one, the inflation was going up long before the war in Ukraine started. So if everything was great until February 27, and then Russia invades, and then all of a sudden the inflation goes up, all right, let's talk about it. But that's not true. This inflation goes back to late 2021. It was persistent in the fall. We all remember the Fed and the Treasury saying transitory, transitory, transitory. And then finally, Jay Powell was testifying before Congress. He said it's time to retire the word transitory. So that was his way of throwing in the towel. And Janet Yellen admitted she was mistaken also. So it predates the war. Number one, energy prices are going up because there's a war with Russia. Well, I wonder why that is. Well, the reason is not because Putin invaded Ukraine. It's because the US counterattacked with financial sanctions. Now, bear in mind, go back to January 21st, 2021, when Biden was sworn in as president and then went back to the White House. What was the first thing he did? He closed the Keystone XL pipeline. This is a pipeline that would bring oil from Alberta, Canada, into the United States, where it would connect at a hub. I believe it's in Kansas, but somewhere in the central United States. Then the hub distributes it to the entire country. So he shut down that pipeline, which curtailed the supply of oil from Canada, then ended new leasing, oil and gas exploration, leasing on federal lands. Handicapped. The fracking industry took a number of other steps using environmental tools, climate alarm, government subsidies, etc., to basically, to the extent possible, shut down the US energy industry as much as possible. Now, you can't shut down completely, of course, but everything happens at the margin. And then we end up with oil prices doubling or tripling, really from $40 to $120 in under a year, which is comparable to what happened in 1973 with the Arab oil embargo. And then Biden wakes up and says, guess we need more oil. And so he wants to reopen leasing. I said they shut down. They did, but he wants to reopen it. He's begging Saudi Arabia to pump more. Saudi Arabia is kind of not returning his phone calls. He's begging Venezuela to pump more. Oh, great. The greatest pariah dictator in the Western Hemisphere, and we're begging him for oil. Say, why don't we drill our own oil? Because we were a net exporter up until 2021. And then Biden came in and we lost that edge and became a net importer, including recently buying oil from Russia. They curtailed that for political reasons, but that's kind of where we got to. So you wonder why the price of energy is going up. In other words, this damage was self-inflicted. But don't be misled by the headlines, because they're, again, this narrative. I think I can keep this brief in the sense that a lot of what's going to affect the stock market is the geopolitical situation. So we talked about that in depth. But if you're just buying the S&P 500 index from Vanguard or Fidelity, and it's been going up, and it has been going up. There's no question about that. And you're like, I'll just sit there and watch it go up. Be careful. We've been warning about a stock market decline for a long time. It's happening. I mean, by the way, the NASDAQ people forget this because Wall Street is out to sell your stocks. And CNBC says up. The NASDAQ peaked in November 2021. Go look at a 3-year chart and say what was the all-time high of NASDAQ. It was November 2021, and it's been down ever since. Now, it went down and came back, and it's going down again. Okay? There's volatility. And if you're a day trader, fine, good for you. Good luck trying to pick the spots. But the fact is, it's been going down for almost 2 years, and it's going down pretty heavily now because the error is out of the tech balloon. There's nothing I see that's going to make that better. I don't think the Fed's done raising interest rates. We'll talk more next week about what could happen. Yeah, and I remember the 1970s. The stock market peaked. Dow Jones peaked in 1969. It didn't get back to that peak until 1982. Now, okay, 1982 was the beginning of one of the greatest bull markets in history. Grant that. But 69, 82 is 13 years. It went sideways. Now, again, there's volatility in dips and peaks. I'm not saying you can't make money, but I'm saying that there's a 13-year period when the stock market ended up where it started. Number one, around 1,000 on the Dow. And when you adjust for inflation, because we had massive inflation in the late 1970s, it was still down. So that's 13 years. Well, we're 2 years into this dip, and the NASDAQ is nowhere near where it was 2 years ago. That's the first thing that's going to get worse because the US is heading into a recession, and we may be in a recession. Everyone's like, wait a second. Yesterday, GDP was up 5%, and that was the number. It was the first government estimate for the third quarter of 2023. It was up 5%, but it was very heavy on consumption and very heavy on inventory. So when those two things, well, consumption, obviously, people don't realize when wholesalers and distributors build up inventory. That counts as GDP. Well, it's fine to build up inventory if people are buying the stuff, but if they don't buy the stuff and you're up to the rafters in inventory, you got to start writing it down. This is where you go to the Gap and you get like 10 shirts and 5 pairs of jeans for $30. I mean, this is what happens. They slash prices. They do 2-for-1 sales. They just move the merchandise. And particularly in certain areas, stuff goes out of style. And the fashion industry is notorious. Who wants last year's coat or whatever? So then the inventory situation comes down to the consumer. Are people buying stuff? It looks like the consumer hit the brakes in August. Now, the second quarter is July, August, September, sometime around mid to late August, after 2 pretty strong months. And they were strong. The consumers just hit the brakes. Now, they had done enough to make the third quarter strong. But going into the fourth quarter, they may just not show up for the game. A couple of reasons for that. You go back to 2020, 2021, what was going on? Well, starting with Trump in, I think, June 2020, he gave everybody a $1,400 check. If you got a heartbeat, you got a check. And then Trump did it again in December, just before he left office. It was another $600 check. Biden comes in and says, well, I can top that. And Biden does in February 2021, right after he was sworn in. Here comes another $1,600 check. And then there was Build Back Better, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually the greenest scam. We were spending not spending. We were running deficits of $2 trillion a year for about 4 or 5 years. The total spending was higher than that. But the deficit alone was about $2 trillion. A no Nancy Pelosi handing out money. Well, the Americans got used to that. Thanks for the check. And then there was a deferment on student loans. You didn't have to pay your student loans for about at least 2 years, maybe a little bit longer. And then when people got those checks, they saved a lot of it. So what happened in 2023? People drew down their savings. The savings rate got really low, like 3%. It was up around 13% during the pandemic. It's about a little over 3%, 3.5% right now, which is low. They spent the savings they had. They didn't make new savings. And then they turned to the credit cards and ran up their credit card balances. Well, that feels good for a while. But then if you're paying the minimum and rolling over the balance and you're at your limit, your credit limit is used up and the interest rates are 20%. Some of them are 28%. You're going to double that balance in 3 years. If you're like, I'll just pay the minimum this month and I'll figure it out, your balance is going up because the interest is compounding faster than you're paying it down at 5%. So people are tapped down on their credit cards. They've used up their savings. They're getting into a deeper hole because the interest is compounding faster than they can pay off the credit cards, and they're just backing away. And it's showing up in things like gasoline consumption. It's way down. Gasoline is what economists call the demand for gasoline is what economists call inelastic, meaning you just have to buy it no matter what the price is. You got to take the kids to school, or get to work, or go shut whatever it is. You're just going to buy the gasoline, even if you don't like the price. By the way, lately price has been coming down a little bit, which is another. That sounds good, but it's actually a bad sign because it's disinflationary, which kind of leans in the direction of a recession. But for gasoline consumption to drop, forgetting about the price, that means people are not driving. They're not going on vacation. They're not doing road trips. They're not driving any more than they have to. There are a lot of other signs. We don't have time to get into all the technicals with negative swap spreads and inverted yield curves and all the rest. But it does look like the consumer slammed on the brakes around late August, early September. The fourth quarter could be a disaster. The stock market is starting to wake up to that fact. So I would say it's a pretty simple recommendation, Matt. Reduce your expenses.
Notably in 1980 and 1981. Regrettably, analysts anticipate that the recession will surpass expectations, with the bottom potentially falling lower than predicted, perhaps a 30% to 50% decline in the S&P, around 22,100. While we had a brief respite between 2020 and 2023, the situation is worsening in 2023 due to the concurrent financial crisis. The financial crisis is currently brewing, causing widespread panic. If it materializes, the impact will be severe, marking a dark day for America and the world. It's important to note that each financial crisis carries its unique level of impact, ranging from substantial to less significant losses. Predicting the scale and duration of a crisis is challenging, as evidenced by the subprime mortgage crisis from 2007 to 2008, which coincided with a recession, resulting in a disastrous outcome. The expansion of mortgage credit triggered this crisis, enabling widespread borrowing and mortgage acquisition. This mistake led to the collapse of the U.S. housing market, causing many to lose their homes, savings, and jobs. The repercussions extended globally given America's pivotal role in world trade. Discussions on recession, inflation, and deflation aside, one aspect yet to be addressed, referenced earlier, is the possibility of a global liquidity crisis. In 1998, despite the absence of a recession, the financial world faced a near collapse. Such crises can coincide with recessions, resulting in severe consequences. A notable instance is the subprime mortgage crisis from 2007 to 2008. There's speculation that 2023 might witness a collision between a financial crisis and recession, resembling the 2007-2008 scenario. Financial experts, including Jim Rickards, highlight signs indicating such a development. These signs include a diminishing world trade, daily declines in industrial output coupled with rising unemployment, and historically high interest rates for the past 15 years, aimed at combating inflation but failing to curb inflated prices. If there are lingering doubts about the recession and financial crisis, examining the recent state of American banks provides clarity. In just a month, 5 major banks have faced setbacks, such as bankruptcy, FDIC takeovers, and collapses. The combined losses of credit and stockholders from these events surpass $200 billion, sending a clear signal of systemic issues. Efforts by the FDIC to reassure the public include unconventional measures, such as guaranteeing depositors sums exceeding $200 billion for Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. These unprecedented actions, while seemingly noble, are predicted by Jim Rickards to deplete the FDIC insurance fund, ultimately affecting consumers. Moreover, the Federal Reserve's decision to extend more loans to member banks through the Bank Term Funding Program, BTFP, is causing significant turmoil in the U.S. banking system. These moves have intensified public anxiety, particularly among depositors. Concerns arise regarding whether these actions aim to implement new policies or if they are motivated by the interests of a few affected entities. The parallels to the 2008 crisis, where the FDIC guaranteed all bank deposits, echo in current events. As the government faces unrealized losses exceeding $700 billion in U.S. bank portfolios, the continued cash provision to depositors raises concerns about the sustainability of the banking system. The looming question is whether the crisis is truly over, or if the panic is just beginning. Drawing parallels with the 2008 financial crisis, which started a year and 6 months before reaching a critical stage, the current crisis, only a month old, has already led to the downfall of 5 banks. Addressing the broader economic situation, the FDIC's guaranteeing of all depositors, and the Federal Reserve's offer of additional loans through BTFP signify pervasive issues. The Fed's guaranteeing of all bank deposits surpassing the $250,000 insurance limit echoes actions taken in 2008 to avert bank runs. However, such measures may strain the FDIC insurance fund with potential consequences for consumers. As the government grapples with increasing unrealized losses in U.S. bank portfolios, the fear is that continuous cash provision to depositors will hasten the collapse of the banking system. Despite attempts to reassure the public, it remains uncertain whether the crisis is truly averted. The interconnectedness of the banking system and the broader economy becomes evident, reflecting a situation that extends beyond individual instances. The Fed's unusual actions, coupled with the FDIC's extraordinary measures, intensify the prevalent challenges. Considering the gravity of the situation, the looming question is, what should one do? How does one respond to the panic and secure oneself against the impending crisis? While the inevitable cannot be avoided, taking proactive steps to preserve wealth becomes crucial. According to Jim Rickards, the first step is acquiring gold.
Down 20% in 3 months, getting close to crashing it. So what happens next? First week of January, Powell comes out, okay, we're not going to raise interest rates anymore. We're going to be patient. They use all these code words. We're going to be patient. Then he starts cutting rates. Then he starts QE, I forget if it was 8 or 9, whatever, lost track of QE. He starts QE 8, let's say. And then that takes you into 2020, and here comes the pandemic, and rates go down to 0, and the balance sheet goes to $7 trillion. They were back where they were in May of 2013. Except worse, because now the balance sheet was even bigger than it was then. A complete failure. So who thinks they're going to be more successful this time? They're doing the same thing. It's going to happen faster this time because the market saw that whole 7-year fiasco from May to 2013 to May 2020, a 7-year round trip failure. The same thing's going to happen, but it's going to happen faster this time because the market knows that the Fed doesn't know what they're doing. So the Fed's tightening into weakness. One of two things is going to happen. And it's not clear which, but it's going to be one or the other. They're going to keep tightening and keep tightening and keep tightening, try to get a handle on inflation and crash the stock market. Or they're going to lose their nerve, back off on the tightening, and then inflation is just going to rip, which will also crash the stock market. So take your pick, but it's going to be one or the other. But this idea of a soft landing is nonsense. The 2021 thesis was that, inflation grew. Part of it was base effects because, the way the government calculates inflation, it's monthly data compared to the year before. So it's year over year, monthly, then annualized. And so one could easily explain inflation in April, May, June 2021 because you were comparing it to 2020, which was the worst recession since 1946. But the base effects would run off in September, October, November. But the inflation persisted, even though the base effects were gone. So now it's like, okay, this is real inflation. It's coming from somewhere else. It was coming from the supply chain, which the Fed can't do anything about either because the Fed doesn't drill for oil. They don't build pipelines and they don't grow wheat. The Fed can't do anything about any of those things. And that's where the war and the sanctions and the continuation of COVID played a role. So, I say you can have your own views, but you can't have your own data. The data is clear. The inflation is here.
The renowned economist Jim Rickards continued her speech as follows. The supply chains are deteriorating, but these disruptions in the supply chain did not originate with the conflict. They didn't even commence with the pandemic. They initiated with the trade war led by Trump in 2018. I discovered an excellent book on this topic, authored by Luan Larocco. What's intriguing about her book is that she completed it in late 2019, serving almost as a control experiment. It predates the pandemic. It's convenient to attribute the disruption in the supply chain to the pandemic, which indeed played a role. And the conflict also had its impact. However, we have a meticulous examination of the supply chain's condition before either event, and the conclusion is, it was chaotic. It was chaotic back then due to tariffs on China and China redirecting soybean purchase orders from the United States to Brazil. That may seem straightforward because Brazil cultivates soybeans. Well, guess what? You have to transport the ships to Brazilian ports. You have to reorganize all the logistical lanes. That was already happening. The pandemic exacerbated it, and now the conflict exacerbates it even more. Yes, the world is fragmenting. We're disengaging. Globalization is concluding. There will be a new iteration of it. It's not the termination of world trade, but you might witness perhaps the Five Eyes, UK, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and allies in Western Europe forming a new trading bloc while excluding China and Russia. It will resemble somewhat the Cold War. I discussed this with Paul B. However, in the 70s, something similar occurred. It commenced with cost-push inflation. It was the Arab oil embargo in 1973 after the Israel-Arab War. Then the Arabs imposed the embargo on us, quadrupling the price of oil from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel. It might sound inexpensive, but that's a 300% increase. Subsequently, we experienced a severe stock market crash and recession in 1974, the most severe since the Great Depression at that time. We've encountered more severe ones since, but back then it was the worst recession since the Great Depression. Following that, the Fed intervened and Nixon abandoned the gold standard. Nixon implemented an accommodating monetary policy in '72, a bit earlier for his re-election effort, etc. So, here comes inflation, but along the way, and then there was another oil embargo, actually an Iranian oil embargo in 1979 after the Ayatollah took over. So there were dual oil shocks. It was a supply-driven cost-push inflation. However, it transformed into demand pull. It evolved into a demand-side scenario that I lived through. I was a young, up-and-coming lawyer at Citibank, a senior officer living in New York City. That was a time when if you desired anything new, furniture, TV set, vacation, anything, you rushed out. You dropped everything, rushed out, and did it because the price was escalating so rapidly. This is instructive in two ways. Firstly, it illustrates that the Fed is consistently behind the curve. It shows that these issues can persist much longer than anticipated. But more crucially, because I believe things will happen more swiftly now, it demonstrates inflation shifting from cost push to demand pull, transitioning from a supply-side matter to a psychological shift on the consumer side. Volcker managed to suppress it, but at a substantial cost. Unemployment reached approximately 11%. He elevated interest rates to 20%. How does that feel? Mortgage holders, student loan holders, and others? 20%. We're talking about 40% on credit cards in that era. People tend to forget, well, doesn't inflation mean you have high growth or whatever? At least low unemployment. No, we had stagflation. We had inflation and high unemployment. There were 3 recessions between 1974 and 1982. We experienced 3 in 1974, 1980, and 1981, which persisted until 1982. By the way, people lost confidence in the dollar in the late 70s. Jimmy Carter's Treasury issued what they call Carter bonds. The U.S. Treasury issued debt in Swiss francs. Now it was Treasury.
You mentioned a fresh perspective on the case for gold, highlighting an impending confrontation within it. Referring to the analogy of tectonic plates, I envision a symbolic representation, perhaps a twig, signifying the fragility of people's confidence within this context. During the keynote presentation at the Sprott Natural Resource Symposium, you began by emphasizing the significance of confidence. Could you elaborate on why this aspect holds such paramount importance in your presentation?
Absolutely. The essence of my presentation focused on gold as the once-in-future money. Historically, gold served as a widely accepted form of currency, yet today, the prevailing belief is that it's merely a commodity, not money. Personally, I view it differently. I consider gold as money and analyze it through that lens. However, this perspective isn't commonly shared. The general consensus disregards gold's monetary attributes and perceives it solely as a commodity. Gold had its prominence as money in the past, but presently, it's not widely acknowledged as money except by a minority, including myself. Yet, I firmly believe it will regain its status as money in the future. The question then becomes, what will drive this shift in perception? To lay the groundwork, I started by questioning the fundamental definition of money. Through various illustrations encompassing feathers, clamshells, euros, gold, silver, beads, digital currencies, credit cards, and Bitcoin, I aim to highlight that throughout history, these diverse forms have all served as money at different times and in specific societies. Criticisms often surface, asserting that certain currencies, like gold, paper dollars, or Bitcoin, lack tangible backing. However, I argue that the common thread among all forms of money is their reliance on one crucial factor: confidence. The crux lies in the confidence shared between individuals in considering something as money. If two parties mutually trust an item's value and its exchangeability for goods and services, it inherently becomes money. This confidence, however, rests upon trust and is exceedingly fragile. Losing this confidence can happen swiftly and is incredibly challenging to restore. Money, as a construct, is far more fragile than commonly perceived because its foundation is rooted in the psychological aspect of confidence, rather than the sheer quantity in circulation. My concern lies in central bankers' disregard for this fragility. Their assumptions about unlimited money printing might lead to crossing an invisible confidence threshold, resulting in a rapid loss of trust and subsequent inflation. In essence, the real essence of any form of money isn't solely tied to economic concepts like printing quantity, but hinges greatly on people's confidence in it. Ignoring this critical aspect poses a significant risk, potentially leading to unforeseen economic consequences in the future.
Certainly. Jim, during your presentation, there was a slide that caught the attention of the entire packed audience, the one where you briefly touched upon the war on cash. However, what piqued interest was your mention of an impending war on gold in the future. Could you elaborate on this aspect as well? It seems like an intriguing and significant perspective that the audience would benefit from understanding further.
Sure. A lot of people have heard the expression war on cash. Governments don't like cash. It's hard for them to trace. And they associate cash with drug dealers, terrorists, and tax evaders. Right. But there are lots of legitimate reasons to have cash. And people who have money in the bank think they can get cash whenever they want. And I make the point that you really can't. You may think you can, but go down to a bank and ask them to give you $20,000 in cash. Let's say you've got $50,000 in your bank account, and you say, "I'd like some cash. Please give me $20,000. They might ask you to come back 3 days later. They might not have that much cash. They'll definitely ask the branch manager to come over because the teller won't be able to handle the transaction for $10,000 or more. They will file a report with the government, the currency transaction report. But even for amounts significantly less than $10,000, if they don't think you've got some cash business like, I don't know, maybe a pizza parlor or something like that, they might file a suspicious activity report. My point is, you won't be treated like an honest American or an honest Canadian or a citizen of the world. You'll be treated like a criminal. They'll do everything possible to discourage you, and you'll find that you actually can't get the cash you think you have. Plus, there are countries in the world. Sweden, I think, is the leading edge that are going to all digital money. They want to get rid of money, meaning paper money or coins. And coins aren't valuable because they're not made of silver. They're made of zinc or copper alloys and so forth. They want to get rid of all paper and coin type money and go to completely digital money. So you have your debit card and your credit card and your wire transfers and your online transfers and all that, but no actual paper or coin type money. Even for the countries or monetary groups that still have paper money, they're reducing it. For example, the Eurozone, the 19 countries that make up the euro, just got rid of the 500 euro note. Until recently, you could get a 500 euro note. There's some still in circulation, but they're going to stop making them. So the next biggest denomination will be the 200 euro note. The United States used to have a $500 bill until the late 60s. Then they got rid of that. Now they have a $100 bill. But the $100 bill of the late 60s, when it was the largest denomination, is only worth 20 cents today in terms of 1960s purchasing power. Even that is kind of going away, not in terms of zeros, but in terms of what it's actually worth. So there's a full-scale war on cash. The point I'm making is that people say, "How's it going?" I said, "Well, it's over. The government won't think. You may think you can get cash, but you can't. But you can get gold. There's nothing stopping." I was in London recently. I went to a place called Sharps Pixley. It's a gold bullion dealer right on the corner of Jermyn Street in St. The kind of fanciest shopping district in London, one of the most attractive retail locations in the world, and you can walk in right off the street. It looks like a bank, but it's not a bank, except maybe it is a gold bank. Walk out to the teller, say, "I'd like to buy 1 kilo of gold." They'll say, "Fine. That's $45,000 and pay with a credit card." Or, "I want to buy a couple of gold coins." And they'll say, "Fine." They won't say dollars. Obviously, they'll say pounds, a couple of £1,000, etc. They'll give you the gold there. If you want to store it, you can store it. They have safe non-bank storage. If you want to walk out the door with it, that's okay too. It's kind of like a knight in the 19th century in London. You could walk up to a normal bank and give them paper money and they would give you gold and you could walk out with it. So Sharps Pixley has reinvented that kind of bank of gold concept. There are very few barriers to owning gold. Sprott has a very good gold fund. There are other gold funds of that type around the world. You can store it yourself. You can get non-bank storage. Don't put it in a bank. I don't recommend that. But non-bank storage is fine. So right now you can get gold. Not at a fixed price. It's not a gold standard, but at the market price. I think the governments haven't really caught on. They've spent so many decades disparaging gold, making fun of gold, ridiculing gold holders, and sort of running gold off the road that I don't think governments are alert to the fact that gold is money. And if you make cash go away, you're actually going to elevate the value of gold to a lot of people. And so I expect that when they suddenly wake up one day and say, wait a second, all these people we tried to chase out of paper money, they're going to gold. There'll be a war on gold. And my advice to people interested in gold is get it now while you still can. Are you waiting for? Some things are changing quite a bit. Some things haven't changed. So some of the fundamental forces are the same. Now, superficially, we've had a lot of news. We've had Brexit. We've had the unexpected rise of Donald Trump. We've had a Turkish coup. And we've seen Venezuela implode. So there have been a lot of very important, very significant political and geopolitical developments can impact gold or commodities one way or the other. But certain things haven't changed. And I think these are important to focus on because they really drive the price of all commodities. The number one thing is the struggle between deflation and inflation. And this is something actually I talked about in my first book, The Currency Wars, in 2011. I made the point because people look at the time series of price indices and we haven't had a lot of either. They've been pretty steady at a pretty low level, around 1.5%, sometimes a little hotter, sometimes a little cooler, at least in dollars. Now, actually, some of the other economies around the world, you're actually seeing deflation in Japan and Europe and elsewhere. But that is because the world is in a naturally deflationary state. The world wants to deflate. Why is that? Demographics. You not just have a slowdown in growth. Globally, you do. But in certain countries, you actually have declining populations. The population in Japan is declining. The population of Russia is declining. The population of China has leveled off and may start to decline. The only reason the US doesn't have negative population growth is because of immigration. The actual birth rate of Americans, ex-immigration, is sort of flatlining. But we do have some population growth because of immigration, but that just means it's coming from somewhere else. And then debt and deleveraging. Talk about helicopter money. We'll just give people money and they'll go spend it. Well, they might not spend it. There are two other things you can do with it. You can save it or you can pay down debt. So just handing out money on street corners doesn't necessarily get you the velocity or the turnover of money or the spending or the GDP that you want, because people might actually, as I say, put it in the bank or pay on debt. And that is going on. So that's debt to leveraging. The third one, of course, is technology, which is a good thing. People say there's bad deflation caused by bad policy, but there's something called good deflation. Maybe we should have another word for it. But when your standard of living goes up, not because you're making more money, but because your cost of living goes down for the same amount of money, you can have a better lifestyle because things are less expensive. And that was predominant in the United States. For example, in the late 19th century, when it was an age of invention, you had the McCormick harvester, the expansion of the railroads, the telegraph, the telephone, the phonograph, and movies. All those things came in the late 19th century, maybe very early 20th century, all of which lowered costs and made people richer without more money, just meant they could do more things were less expensive. So debt deleveraging, debt deleveraging, demographics and technology are causing. I call that the natural state of the world. However, central banks cannot have deflation. They cannot allow it. And I have this debate with our friend Harry Denton and Gary Schilling and others, because they do the deflation analysis I just went through, and I agree with them on that. I think that analysis is correct, but there's a countervailing force, which is central bank policy. Governments cannot have deflation because it increases the real value of the debt. I mean, governments are over-indebted as it is. Japanese debt to GDP ratio is over 250%. Corporate debt, actually corporate, individual, and government debt in China to GDP ratio is over 300%. I mean, these are huge numbers. People pick on Greece, but the rest of the world looks a lot like Greece or is getting there fast. So deflation increases the real value of debt. So if you're over-indebted to begin with, the last thing you want is deflation. There are other reasons why governments don't want deflation, but they're determined to stop it. So you've got these two tectonic plates. There's the natural tectonic plate of deflation, but there's the policy plate of inflation, which is money printing, currency wars, QE operation, twist, all the central bank toolkit, negative interest rates, zero interest rates, they're pushing against each other. So it kind of looks stable from the outside, but it's dynamically unstable, going to snap. The question is, which way would it go? Central banks could throw up their hands and it could go deeply into deflation, or central banks could pull a few more rabbits out of a hat and it could go into inflation. That kind of monetary instability is part of the case for gold, kind of part of the new case for gold, as I call my book. But the point being, that hasn't changed. This has been going on for 5 years, and except that the forces keep getting stronger. The forces of debt deflation, negative interest rates, deleveraging get stronger. The forces of money printing and policy, and I think we'll soon see world money in the form of special drawing rights, or SDOs. So these forces are not only coming together, they're getting more powerful, and they're going to snap when no one knows. But you can say that it certainly will happen. The effect will be dramatic. When it does happen, I definitely want to own gold, at least for part of my portfolio. But I do have the sense that we're getting closer to some very significant break in the system.
Slowing industrial output, slowing retail sales, and importantly, for investors, a very sharp decline in inflation. So this is one of the kind of mystifying points about the U.S. stock market. I mean, it seems straightforward to me, but market has their own dynamic. They're saying, well, if the Fed raises rates the way I've described and they cause a recession, the Fed's going to have to cut rates. That's called the pivot, the Fed pivot, and lower rates are good for tech stocks, so buy stocks. But think about that for a second. What if inflation comes down faster than the Fed thinks? And I think it may, by the way, I'll return to that. What if inflation comes down really fast and they get to the target rate sooner than they think? Does that mean they might have to cut? Well, it might, but what's good about that for stocks? I mean, if that happens, no one ever says, why did that happen? They just say, well, inflation may come down, interest rates may come down, so buy stocks. It's like, well, inflation may come down, interest rates may come down, but if it does, it's because we're in a very severe recession, exactly what I'm forecasting. And so if that's the case, stocks are going to plunge, 30, 40, 50%. So don't root for lower rates, or if you're forecasting lower rates, understand what that means. It doesn't mean the Fed chickened out. It doesn't mean life is wonderful and you should buy tech stocks. It means that we're in the very severe recession that I described, and I think we will end up there. And therefore, stocks are going to plunge. So, be careful what you wish for, as they say. My forecast is, yeah, they are going to raise rates. They're going to over-tighten. They're going to cause a very severe recession. And when they do, they may pivot at that time, but it won't be for good reasons. It'll be for very bad reasons, meaning we're in a recession and stocks have plunged. So don't buy into the Wall Street chatter as far as that's concerned, because as I say, the Fed's going to over tighten.
Now, why isn't the Federal Reserve aware of this? Well, because they never are. Because they have the poorest forecasting record of any institution I can think of. Their entire history since 1913 is one mistake after another, and this will just be the latest in the long series. So, just to kind of recap, the Fed is on a trajectory. We know precisely what it is because they informed us. All you have to do is listen to them and believe them. They're going to increase rates, let high rates do their work, and observe the inflation come down, and maybe in 2024 decrease rates. What I anticipate is they are going to raise rates for the next couple of meetings exactly as I've outlined, but they're going to over-tighten. The signs of recession are already present. The Fed's not looking at them. I'll come back to what they are, by the way. And we'll be in a very severe recession for a lot of reasons. And that's going to mean a plunge in stock prices. So if the Fed cuts rates, don't cheer too loudly, because it'll be in a world where severe recession, higher unemployment, and crashing stock prices are the norm. I'd like to conclude on, I can't call it a joyful note, but a global liquidity crisis. Now, I talked about a global recession, and people go, well, isn't that like a liquidity crisis? No, a recession or a depression is very different than a liquidity crisis or a financial panic. They're two different things. They can and do happen separately. In 2008, we had both. In 2008, the recession or depression and a financial panic converged, so they can happen together, but they don't have to. They can happen individually. What we're in for visually looks like a global financial crisis and a global recession at the same time, coming sooner than later. Now, why do I say that? there's a global dollar shortage. People go, wait a second. The Fed printed $9 trillion, which they did in 2020. It's come down since then, but they did print that much money. How could there be a global dollar shortage? What people don't understand is that behind the curtain off-balance sheet, this is off-balance sheet. You've got to go read the footnotes and understand what you're reading. There are $1 quadrillion of derivatives. And for those not familiar with quadrillion, 1 quadrillion is 1,000 trillion. So, I just said the Fed printed $9 trillion. Maybe it's down to 7 trillion, but you have $1 quadrillion of derivatives, and they have to be supported with collateral. Not 100%, not even 10%. I mean 1% or 2% is enough. But when you're in a liquidity crisis, banks are extremely choosy about which collateral they'll accept to support this $1 quadrillion inverted pyramid of derivatives. And right now what they're saying, because this evolves, it gets worse. It doesn't happen overnight. It can become acute overnight, but it happens over the course of a year or longer. What we see, the banks are saying, I don't want corporate bonds as collateral. I don't want your mortgages as collateral. I don't even want 10-year treasuries as collateral. The only collateral I want are short-term U.S. Treasury bills. Treasury bills have a maximum maturity of 1 year, 360 days, but there can be 4-week bills, 8-week bills, 6-month bills, etc. That's the best form of collateral. It's the most liquid, easily traded, low volatility, easy to repledge, is by far the best form of collateral. That's all the banks want right now. But if you're a foreign bank, you need dollars to buy the dollar-based collateral. If you want treasury bills that are denominated in dollars, you need dollars to buy the bills. That's why the US dollar is so strong. People go, wait a second, the US has a multi-trillion-dollar annual budget deficit, a massive trade deficit, 132% debt to GDP ratio, $31 trillion in debt. You're going into a recession. How can the dollar be so strong? The answer is everything I just said has nothing to do with the demand for dollars in international foreign exchange markets.
The constant rise of the markets is perplexing, isn't it? Despite the less than stellar state of the economy, ongoing political turmoil, and the overall uncertainty within America, I have some pressing thoughts to share, and I'm eager to hear from our expert, Jim Rickards. Jim, here are the queries. How can stocks continue to climb amidst the looming threat of World War III, ongoing conflicts, soaring national debt, and a chaotic political landscape? Another question that's on everyone's mind is why the stock market seems buoyant despite the barrage of negative news. Investors and Americans alike are seeking answers, Jim. What's your perspective on this perplexing situation?
The S&P 500, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and the NASDAQ 100 all peaked in late 21 and January 2022. Look at a 3-year chart. Stop looking at a 3-day chart. People in general stop looking at 3-day charts. At a 3-year chart. They all peaked in NASDAQ, peaked in November 2021, and Dow Jones and SP peaked in January, like the first week of January 2022. Those indices are down significantly from where they were almost 2 years ago, or over 2 years ago. So you can talk about the bull market all you want. They're down over the last 2 years period. Now, has there been a rally lately? Yeah, and there have been 4 or 5 along the way. And I'm not saying you can't make money, but I'm saying that in this volatility, up and down, the trend is down. So let's not get too excited about the stock market because the trend is down as I described. Just look at a 3-year chart. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Now, where do we go from here? Oh, stock markets are bubbly in the face of something horrible, where we've seen that before. I mean, the stock market during the cycle around the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Remember that crisis started in the spring of 2007, kind of reached a fever pitch in August 2007. That was when Jerry Cramer had that famous meltdown with Aaron Bernard on CNBC. They know nothing, etc. But the stock market actually peaked in October 2007. So there we are. 6 months after HSBC warned about rising defaults and mortgages, 2 months after the Fed almost caused a meltdown, Jim Cramer called them out in August 7. But the stock market peaked in October 7. So stock markets go their own way. They're supposed to be leading indicators. They're really not. First of all, the stock market is not peaking. The peak was 2 years ago, right? And the peak is exactly when I said November 15th, 2021. So that's more than 2 years ago, and it still has not regained that peak. So that's the reality. You're right, Matt. There are some rallies, but there's some big dips along the way if you're looking at it. Okay, right now we're in kind of rally mode. Why is it rallying? This started in kind of mid to late October. The Fed signaled that maybe they're done raising interest rates, and maybe they are. We'll talk more about that as we get closer to the, if interest rates go down, stocks go. That's the narrative. Wall Street always has a narrative for no Goldilocks. Soft landing. There's no such thing as a soft landing, by the way. There are hard landings. There are crashes and there are booms, but there's no such thing as a soft landing. You're going down. You're going down. That's why stocks are rallying right now, because interest rates are coming down. But what people don't stop to ask is, okay, interesting. Why are interest rates coming down? Could it be we're in a recession? Could it be we're seeing disinflation? Maybe even deflation? Could it be industrial production was down? Which it was. That was reported the other day. Initial claims are up. That was reported the other day. Unemployment ticked up a little bit. Not huge. But in the last employment report at the beginning of November. This is in addition to the more technical signs. I don't want to get too far in the weeds in terms of inverted yield curves and negative swap spreads and a lot else. Those are long-term or long-range indicators of recession. We've been talking about those for a year. They're very powerful indicators, but they don't tell you the exact timing. But the other items I mentioned, things like industrial production and so forth, are much more real-time, and they're all turning negative. So I would expect the stock market to turn around and kind of go down significantly between now and the end of the year, early next year. Certainly, because by then the data will be undeniable right now. Again, the Wall Street Goldilocks soft landing scenario prevails. It doesn't mean it's right. It just means that that's what people believe. But Wall Street, again, they're just trying to sell you stocks. They'll sell you stocks right up until the day it crashes. I'm actually writing one of our newsletters. I'm writing it today. And I went back and looked at the recessions in 1974 and 1981. And the Dow Jones in 1974 recession, the Dow Jones fell 45%. At today's level, that would be the equivalent of 15,000 Dow points, slightly more. So imagine the Dow Jones down 15,000 points. That's a 45% decline from today's level. And that's what happened in 1974. It's not ancient history. What caused it? Well, it was the Arab. A war in the Middle East and Arab oil and bar went higher. Oil prices sound familiar. I mean, that's kind of what we're going through right now. We're going back to 2021, the supply shock. And then in 1982, 82, that recession, the NASDAQ fell 38%, so peak to trough. So that's what a real recession looks like, and that's what a stock market crash looks like. And so we could be heading for something like that. But it peaks when it peaks. But by the way, it peaked 2 years ago, so we're not even at the peak. But yeah, it could go down 30, 40%, maybe 50% from here.